She was 8 months pregnant, locked in a freezer, and her husband was upstairs pouring himself a glass of scotch, waiting for her to die. But here is what Carter Whitfield did not know about his wife Isabella. She had read every single word of the paperwork he made her sign when he had her committed. Every word, including page 7. And page 7 changed everything. This is not a story about a woman who was saved. This is a story about a woman who saved herself. A former trial attorney who spent 6 years being slowly convinced she was weak, unstable, and incapable of surviving without the man who was quietly poisoning her prenatal vitamins every single morning with a kiss on the forehead. She had $47 in her wallet, a frozen bank account, a psychiatric hold on her record, and a husband with $400 million and a legal team that had already done this once before. She had a brother who made toast when things got bad, a best friend who read blood work at 11 at night, and 11 years of litigation experience that Carter Whitfield, in all of his careful planning, had completely forgotten about. Stay with me, because the moment Isabella figures out what is on page 7 of that intake form, everything changes, and the ending, I promise you, is one you will not see coming. Lesson statement. This story will show you exactly how psychological abuse works, what the warning signs look like from the inside, and why the most dangerous thing a controlling person can do is underestimate the woman they spent years convincing to doubt herself. If Isabella's story stayed with you, do one thing before you leave. Share this with one woman in your life, not because she is necessarily in danger, but because every woman deserves to know that trusting your instincts is not paranoia. It is intelligence. And if you want to be here for the next story, subscribe now so you never miss it. Leave a comment telling me the exact moment you knew Isabella was going to win. I read every single one, and those comments are genuinely the reason this channel exists. Like this video if it moved you. It costs you nothing, and it helps more people find stories that matter. Thank you for being here.
The coffee was perfect. That was the thing Isabella Hartwell kept coming back to later, when she was trying to pinpoint the exact moment she should have known. The coffee was always perfect. The house was always perfect. The flowers on the kitchen island were always fresh, always white, always replaced before they had a chance to wilt. Carter Whitfield did not tolerate things that were less than perfect. Isabella stood at the kitchen window of their Greenwich, Connecticut estate on a Tuesday morning in October, holding her mug with both hands because her fingers were always cold now, 8 months into a pregnancy that had turned her body into something she barely recognized. Outside, the maple trees along the driveway had gone fully red overnight. The lawn was immaculate. The stone wall along the property line looked like something from a magazine, which made sense, because their home had actually been in 3 magazines. She was 35 years old. She had a law degree from Georgetown that she no longer used. She had a husband worth $400 million who kissed her forehead every morning before leaving for the office. She had a nursery, painted the color of a summer sky, with a white crib that had taken 6 weeks to arrive from a craftsman in Vermont. She had everything. She pressed her free hand against her stomach and felt the baby shift, slow and heavy, like a small creature turning over in sleep. "Good morning, James," she said quietly. She had not told Carter the name yet. She was not sure why. She told herself it was because she wanted to surprise him. She did not examine that explanation too closely. Carter came downstairs at 7:15, which was exactly when he always came downstairs. He was wearing the charcoal suit she had picked up from the dry cleaner on Friday. His dark hair was perfect. His jaw was the kind of jaw that made other men unconsciously straighten their posture. He poured himself a coffee, checked his phone, and kissed her on the forehead. "You look tired," he said. It was not unkind. It was an observation, the way you might note the weather. "I slept fine," Isabella said. "You should rest today. Don't push yourself." He was already moving toward the door, already somewhere else in his mind. "I have the Hargrove meeting this morning and the Stamford site this afternoon. Might be late. Okay, she said. He paused at the door and looked back at her with the warm, steady expression she had fallen in love with 6 years ago. The expression that said, "You are safe, you are cared for, everything is handled." "Take your vitamins," he said. Then he was gone. Isabella stood at the window and watched the black Range Rover back down the driveway. She watched until it disappeared around the corner. Then she stood there a little longer, looking at the empty driveway, the perfect lawn, the red maple trees. Something felt wrong. She could not name it. She had been trying to name it for 3 weeks, maybe 4, this low-level vibration in her chest that showed up whenever Carter left a room. Her mother used to say that women's instincts were the most underrated intelligence on earth. Her mother used to say that when something feels wrong and you cannot explain why, that is not anxiety. That is your brain processing information your conscious mind has not caught up to yet. Isabella had spent a lot of years being a lawyer. She knew the difference between evidence and feeling. She also knew that most evidence started as a feeling. She went to Carter's office to look for the charitable donation receipts. The office was on the first floor, off the main hallway, with dark wood paneling and bookshelves that Carter's interior designer had filled with books Carter had never read. Isabella had always found this slightly funny. She had never said so. She found the charitable donation folder in the second drawer of the filing cabinet, right where Carter had said it would be. She pulled it out, and then, because she was reaching past it, because her hand caught the edge of something behind it, she pulled out the thing behind it too. It was a credit card statement. American Express. Carter Whitfield. An account number she did not recognize. She almost put it back. She stood there for a full 10 seconds, holding the statement, telling herself this was a business account, a separate account for expenses, something completely ordinary with a completely ordinary explanation. Then she looked at the charges. The Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. 12 times in 4 months. $380 a night. Tiffany and Company, $2,400. Restaurants in cities where Carter had attended, according to his calendar, investor conferences. Isabella's hands were steady. She had learned, in 11 years of practicing law, to keep her hands steady when her brain was screaming. She photographed every page of the statement with her phone. She put the statement back exactly where she had found it. She went upstairs to her bathroom, sat on the edge of the tub, and opened Instagram. Later, she would describe this moment with a kind of rueful humor. 8 months pregnant, sitting on the bathroom floor of a $4 million house, Googling her husband's personal trainer like a 22-year-old discovering heartbreak for the first time. Brooke Calloway's Instagram was public. Brooke was 29. She was extraordinarily beautiful in the specific way of someone who treats physical appearance as a professional obligation. Her most recent post was from 3 days ago. A photo of herself in front of a restaurant in Washington, D.C., captioned with a location tag and 3 flame emojis. The date matched the most recent Mayflower Hotel charge. Isabella put her phone face down on her knee. She put her hand on her stomach. She felt James move, that slow rolling shift, completely unbothered by the fact that his mother's entire understanding of her life was quietly rearranging itself into a shape she did not yet recognize. "Okay," she said, to herself, to the baby, to the bathroom tiles. "Okay, think." She thought like a lawyer. She thought about what she had: a credit card statement, a public Instagram account, and a feeling that had been building for weeks. She thought about what she needed: context, pattern, documentation. She spent 2 hours in the bathroom, cross-referencing Carter's calendar on the household shared account with Brooke's public Instagram posts. 14 dates in 4 months aligned. Not approximately. Exactly. When Carter came home that evening, Isabella had dinner on the table and a smile on her face that did not reach her eyes, which Carter did not notice because Carter rarely looked at her eyes anymore. "Brooke Calloway," Isabella said, passing him the bread basket. "Isn't she a client of yours? I think someone mentioned her at the Harrington Gala." Carter reached for the bread. "She does some wellness consulting for the company. Why?" "No reason," Isabella said. "Someone just mentioned her name." Carter nodded and began talking about the Stamford site. Isabella watched him talk and thought. He did not hesitate, not even a fraction of a second. He was very, very good at this, which meant he had been doing it for a very long time. She excused herself early, citing the pregnancy, and lay in the dark listening to Carter move around downstairs. She thought about her mother's voice. She thought about the 14 dates. She thought about the fact that she had signed a prenuptial agreement that gave her almost nothing if she initiated divorce proceedings without documented cause. She thought about the vitamins Carter reminded her to take every single morning. The vitamins he personally refilled from a pharmacy she had never visited. She thought, "I need to talk to Maggie." She thought, "I need to talk to Ryan." She thought, "Something is wrong, and it is bigger than an affair, and I need to be very, very careful." Outside, the October wind moved through the red maple trees, and the house was silent. And somewhere downstairs, her husband, the man who had promised before God and their families to love and protect her, poured himself a glass of scotch and made a phone call in a voice too low to hear. Maggie Collins had been Isabella's best friend since the 7th grade, when they had been assigned adjacent lockers and discovered they both hated gym class with a passion that bordered on spiritual. Maggie had gone on to become an obstetrician. Isabella had gone on to become a corporate attorney. They had grown into completely different versions of themselves and remained completely identical in the ways that mattered. Maggie's office was in a practice in Cos Cob, 10 minutes from the Whitfield estate. She had been Isabella's OB since the beginning of the pregnancy. She was also, on a professional level, the most unflappable person Isabella had ever met. She had seen everything the human body could produce and was surprised by essentially none of it. So when Maggie looked up from Isabella's blood work results on a Wednesday morning and her expression changed, Isabella noticed immediately. "Talk to me," Isabella said. Maggie has set the file down on the desk. She had the careful stillness of someone choosing her words with the kind of precision usually reserved for diffusing explosives. "Your liver enzymes are elevated," Maggie said. "That can happen in the 3rd trimester. It's not automatically alarming, but I want to watch it. What is more concerning to me is your B6 levels." "My B6. Pyridoxine, vitamin B6. Your levels are significantly elevated. Not dangerously so, not yet, but enough that I want to understand why." Maggie paused. "Isabella, excessive B6 during pregnancy can cause nerve damage. It can cause neurological symptoms. In high enough doses, it can be quite harmful." Isabella was quiet for a moment. "I take the prenatal vitamins Carter gets me." "What brand?" "I don't know. He refills them. They come in a plain white bottle." Maggie was very still. "Isabella, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, not as my patient, but as my friend of 23 years. Ask. Is there any reason that someone might want to harm you or the baby?" The question landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Isabella heard it and felt it and sat with it for what felt like a very long time. Then she told Maggie everything. She told her about the credit card statement. She told her about the 14 dates. She told her about Brooke Calloway and the Instagram posts and Carter's perfectly smooth answer at the dinner table. She told her about the feeling that had been building for weeks, the low vibration she could not name. Maggie listened without interrupting, which was one of her great gifts. When Isabella finished, Maggie picked up the prenatal vitamin bottle that Isabella had brought in with her other medications and turned it over in her hands. "I'm sending this to the lab," Maggie said. "Full panel, and I want you to take the vitamins I prescribe you from this point forward. These ones stay with me. Carter will notice. Tell him the bottle ran out and you got a refill at the pharmacy near my office. Can you do that?" "I can do that," Isabella said. "I was a trial attorney for 11 years. I can maintain a cover story." Maggie almost smiled. Almost. "I also want you to call Ryan." "I know. Today, Isabella, not tomorrow. I know." Maggie stood and came around the desk and hugged her, carefully, around the considerable circumference of 32 weeks of pregnancy. Isabella let herself be hugged for exactly 10 seconds. Then she straightened up. "Maggie," she said, "how long would it take for elevated B6 to show up in blood work?" "Weeks of consistent exposure. So this has been going on for at least a month. At minimum." Isabella nodded. She picked up her bag. She walked out through the waiting room past 3 pregnant women in various stages of reading parenting magazines, and she got into her car, and she sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes, allowing herself to feel the full weight of what Maggie had just told her. Then she called her brother. Ryan Hartwell answered on the second ring. "If he thinks we know anything, if he feels cornered—" "I know," Ryan said. His voice was quiet in a way that was somehow more intense than volume. "Bella, I know. We do this smart. We do this completely by the book. And while we're doing it, you go home and you act like everything is fine." "I know how to act like everything is fine. I did it for 6 years. Ryan looked at her across the table. He was not a man who showed emotion easily. Their father had been the same way, but his eyes, right now, were doing something she had not seen since their mother's funeral. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." "You couldn't have seen it," Isabella said. "That's the whole point. He's very good." Frank Doyle arrived 40 minutes later. He was 62, overweight, in the comfortable way of a man who had long since made peace with his relationship with good food, with silver hair and a permanent expression of mild skepticism that Isabella suspected he had been born with. He shook her hand, sat down, accepted a bowl of chili, and said, "Tell me what you have," Isabella told him. Frank ate chili and listened and said nothing until she was completely finished. Then he set his spoon down and said, "The vitamin thing is your opener, but it won't close the case alone. A competent defense attorney turns it into contamination, manufacturing error, something the wife misunderstood. We need financials, we need communication records, and most importantly, we need him on tape saying something he cannot walk back." "How do we get that?" "Carefully," Frank said, "and slowly, and without him knowing we're getting it." He looked at Isabella steadily. "Can you go home tonight and make dinner and watch television and act like a woman who has absolutely no idea that anything is wrong?" "I practiced law for 11 years, Isabella said. "I once cross-examined a CFO for 4 hours while having the flu and 101 fever." Frank nodded slowly. "Good. Because the most important thing you can do right now is let Carter think he's winning. Men like Carter get careless when they think they've won. And careless men make mistakes." He picked up his spoon again. "Here's your first piece of advice, and it applies to anyone in a situation like yours. Do not confront. Do not reveal. Document everything, and let the other person believe they have the upper hand. The moment they feel safe, they start talking." Isabella drove home that night through the dark Connecticut streets and pulled into the perfect driveway of the perfect house and sat in the car for a moment looking at the lit windows. Then she went inside and told Carter She'd had a lovely afternoon at Maggie's, and her blood pressure was excellent, and she was craving pasta. Carter made her pasta from scratch because he was an excellent cook, because he had built his entire personality around being excellent at the things that could be observed. Isabella ate every bite and told him it was wonderful. And somewhere, in a lab in Fairfield County, Maggie's sample request was being processed, and the results were going to be ready in 48 hours, and the clock had started. Frank Doyle had a system. He had developed it over 30 years of investigating people who believed they were smarter than everyone around them, and the system was simple: follow the money, because people lie constantly, but bank statements lie never. He spent the first 3 days pulling every piece of Carter Whitfield's public financial record that existed: corporate filings, property records, court documents from 3 separate civil suits that had been settled quietly in the past 4 years. The public record of a man with $400 million turned out to be quite extensive and quite interesting and quite different from the private reality. Morrison Tech, he had written in an earlier story. Here it was Whitfield Development Group, and the story was the same. The company had been hemorrhaging money for 18 months. A major commercial development in Stamford had gone catastrophically over budget. 2 anchor tenants had backed out of a mixed-use project in Hartford. There were lawsuits from subcontractors, lawsuits from investors. A quiet SEC inquiry that had not yet become public. Carter Whitfield was not a $400 million man. Carter Whitfield was a man who owed approximately $260 million and had assets of somewhere around 90, and the gap between those two numbers was being managed with the kind of financial creativity that had a formal name, and that name was fraud. Frank called Isabella on a Thursday evening while she was folding laundry in the bedroom. Carter safely downstairs on a work call. "He's broke," Frank said without preamble. Isabella kept folding. "How broke?" "The kind of broke that needs a solution. A big one, fast." "The life insurance policy. I haven't confirmed the amount yet, but yes, that would be the solution." A pause. "Isabella, I pulled the record on his first wife." Isabella set down the shirt she was folding. Helena Whitfield, née Helena Marsh, died 6 years ago, Lake Tahoe. She fell from the deck of their vacation property during a rainstorm, ruled accidental death after a brief investigation." Another pause. Longer. The lab results came back from Maggie. Isabella waited. The vitamins contained synthetic pyridoxine at approximately 4 times the recommended daily dose. They also contain a compound called phenobarbital, which is a mild sedative. It's not enough to knock you out. It's enough to make you foggy, slow, confused, emotional. He stopped. It would make a pregnant woman seem unstable, erratic, like someone whose mental health was deteriorating under the stress of pregnancy. The laundry was in a neat pile on the bed. The room was very quiet. He was building a narrative, Isabella said. For how long, we don't know, but yes, that's what it looks like. Isabella thanked Frank and ended the call and sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 3 minutes. She was building a specific kind of discipline, the kind that allowed you to feel the full impact of something terrible and then set it aside and keep moving. She had used this discipline in courtrooms. She had used it when her father died. She was using it now. She picked up the laundry. She put it away. She went downstairs and told Carter she was feeling a little tired and was going to turn in early. Carter looked up from his laptop with the warm, steady expression. "Take your vitamins before you sleep," he said. "Of course," she said. She went upstairs and took Maggie's vitamins and dropped Carter's into the small Ziploc bag she kept taped behind the bathroom mirror, adding to a collection that now numbered 11 capsules, all of which were going to be part of a criminal evidence filing before this was over. The next morning, while Carter was at a site meeting in Stamford, Isabella went through with his office with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who had spent 11 years preparing for litigation. She photographed 147 pages of documents, financial records, correspondence, insurance policy summaries, a folder labeled simply Helena that she almost could not bring herself to open and then opened anyway because James needed her to. Inside the Helena folder were insurance claim documents. The payout, $18,200,000, and a handwritten note in Carter's writing that said only DG final payment confirmed. DG. She photographed it and moved on. That evening, Ryan came over for dinner under the pretext of checking on his pregnant sister, which Carter tolerated with the gracious condescension of a man who considered his brother-in-law mildly irrelevant. Ryan ate Carter's excellent roasted chicken and talked about a security contract he was bidding on and gave absolutely no indication that he had spent the afternoon with Frank Doyle mapping out the architecture of his brother-in-law's criminal enterprise. After Carter went to bed, Ryan helped Isabella with the dishes. "DG," Ryan said quietly, his back to the doorway. "Frank's running it," Isabella murmured. "Could be initials. Could be an LLC abbreviation. Frank will find it. I know." Ryan handed her a dried plate. "How are you actually doing?" Isabella considered the question honestly. "I'm functioning," she said. "I'm keeping it very separate. The part of me that understands what is happening and the part of me that has to live in this house and sleep next to this man. I'm keeping those two things in completely separate rooms inside my head. That can't be sustainable." "It doesn't have to be sustainable for long," she said. "It just has to hold until we have enough." Ryan nodded. He did not push further. This was one of his great gifts, knowing when to stop. Frank called the next morning with the answer on DG. "Douglas Grimley," Frank said. "Not far. I was wrong about the name earlier. Douglas Grimley, LLC, registered in Nevada, dissolved 2 weeks after Helena Whitfield's death. The registered agent," he paused. Isabella, the registered agent, was a structural engineer. His specialty was residential deck and balcony safety assessment. The silence on Isabella's end lasted 5 seconds. "Helena fell from a deck," Isabella said. "Yes, she did." "Frank, what is the engineer's first name?" "Todd Grimley." Isabella thought about Brooke Calloway. She thought about the Instagram posts, the Mayflower Hotel, the Porsche that had appeared on Brooke's feed 4 months ago. "Frank," she said, "I need you to run a background check on Brooke Calloway. Full history, family connections, prior addresses, maiden name if applicable. Give me a few hours." It took Frank 2.5 hours. Brooke Calloway's legal name was Brooke Grimley. Todd Grimley was her older brother. Isabella sat with this information for a long time. She sat with the understanding that Carter had not simply had an affair with a convenient woman. He had recruited a partner whose family member he had already used once to commit murder, and he was using her again. And the affair was not a complication to his plan. It was part of it. She called Maggie. "I need to ask you something medical," Isabella said. "If someone wanted to make a death look like an accident involving a pregnant woman, if they wanted to lay groundwork for a narrative of mental instability, what would the ideal timeline look like?" Maggie was quiet for a moment. "You'd start building the mental health narrative first. Weeks, maybe months before, you'd want a documented history. You'd want people who could testify that the woman had been struggling, emotional, erratic, and the vitamins. The sedative component would reinforce it. If she seemed confused or emotional in public, people would attribute it to pregnancy. They wouldn't look for another explanation." "He's been building this for months," Isabella said. "Yes," Maggie said. "He has." There was a pause between them, the pause of two women who had been friends since the 7th grade and were now sitting inside a situation that neither of them had any framework for. Bella, Maggie said, I need you to hear me. We have the vitamin evidence. Frank has the financial evidence. The Grimley connection is extraordinary, but you need to be somewhere safe. If I leave, it looks like flight. His lawyers turn it into evidence of instability. If you stay, I know the risk, Isabella said quietly. I know exactly what the risk is. I'm 34 weeks pregnant, and I'm living with a man who paid someone to compromise a deck railing so his first wife would fall off it. I know the risk. Maggie was silent. I also know, Isabella continued, that I was a trial attorney for 11 years. I know how evidence gets built, and I know how it gets destroyed, and I know that the only way this ends well for James and me is if we do this completely right, which means I need a little more time. She did not get as much time as she needed. Carter moved first. The psychiatric hold papers were filed on a Monday. Isabella found out the way she found out everything now. Through a phone call from Frank, who had a contact at the county courthouse who had flagged the filing the moment it appeared. She was sitting in Maggie's waiting room at the time, and she remembers that there was a woman across from her, reading a magazine with a golden retriever on the cover, and that the normalcy of this was almost funny. Carter's attorney, Davis Hargrove, had filed an emergency petition with family court claiming that Isabella Whitfield had been exhibiting signs of severe prenatal psychosis. The petition was supported by a psychiatric evaluation from a Dr. William Farr, who described Isabella as delusional, emotionally volatile, potentially dangerous to herself and the unborn child. The evaluation included dated session notes. Isabella had never met Dr. William Farr in her life. He manufactured a psychiatric history, Frank said on the phone. Farr created documentation of the sessions that never happened. Can we prove that? Working on it. But Isabella, the petition has been accepted for an emergency hearing, Thursday morning, Judge Harold Fletcher, Family Court. 3 days, she called Ryan from the parking lot. Ryan said things that were not suitable for a recorded line and then said, We need a lawyer, not me, not Frank, an actual family law attorney. I know one, Isabella said. I know a good one. She spent Monday evening preparing for the hearing with the focus of someone who understood that the next 72 hours were going to determine everything. She organized her documents. She drafted a timeline. She wrote down every interaction she could remember with Maggie, with Ryan, with Frank, any witness who could speak to her mental clarity and stability. Carter came home Monday evening and was warm and concerned and asked how she was feeling and suggested she take a warm bath and get to bed early. You've seemed stressed lately, he said. It worries me. I'm fine, Isabella said. You know, I only want what's best for you and the baby. I know, she said. She lay in the dark that night and thought about the hearing. She thought about how it would look. Pregnant woman, clearly under emotional strain, making extraordinary accusations against a well-respected community leader. The manufactured psychiatric evaluation, the carefully documented history of mood swings and confusion, all of it created by the sedative Carter had been feeding her for months. She thought about what Frank had said. Careless men make mistakes. She thought about what she needed Carter to do. She needed him to feel completely safe. So she did something that cost her more than almost anything else in this entire story. She called Carter's cell phone from the upstairs bedroom. He answered immediately. Bella, are you okay? I'm okay, she said. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I've been so emotional lately, so paranoid about things. Maggie says it's completely normal in the 3rd trimester, but I know I've been difficult, and I love you, and I'm sorry. A pause. When Carter spoke, His voice was warm in a way that turned her stomach. "You don't have to apologize," he said. "You're growing our son. You're allowed to be a little overwhelmed. Thank you for being so patient with me." "Always," Carter said. "I'll be right up." She heard him coming up the stairs, and she arranged her face into the expression of a woman who was tired and grateful and completely without suspicion. He was very good. She was better. The family court hearing on Thursday morning was the most controlled performance of Isabella's life. She sat at the respondent's table, 34 weeks pregnant, flanked by her attorney, and she listened to Davis Hargrove read Dr. Farr's evaluation into the record with the calm attention of a woman who had no reason in the world to be afraid. Carter sat across the courtroom in a dark suit. His expression was that of a deeply worried husband. Several of the gallery observers, mostly courthouse staff catching the drama between their own hearings, were visibly sympathetic toward him. Judge Harold Fletcher was a reasonable man. Isabella could see that he was genuinely troubled by the file in front of him. He was not a villain. He was a judge looking at documentation that appeared to show a pregnant woman in psychological distress, and he was trying to do the right thing. That was the terrible part. Carter's plan worked precisely because it weaponized the reasonable instincts of reasonable people. Isabella's attorney challenged the evaluation. She pointed out that the session dates listed in Dr. Farr's notes coincided with dates that Isabella's own calendar, her Maggie's appointment records, could place her elsewhere entirely. She was methodical and excellent. It was not enough. Judge Fletcher granted a 72-hour evaluation order. Isabella was to report voluntarily to the Fairfield County Behavioral Health Center by 5 o'clock that afternoon. Resistance, the judge noted gently, would result in a compelled transport order. Ryan was in the gallery. Isabella looked at him as she stood from the table. He looked like a man who was holding 17 different impulses, completely still through sheer force of will. She walked past him on the way out and pressed her secondary phone into his hand without breaking stride. "Don't stop," she said quietly. "Don't stop for anything." She checked in at 5 o'clock. The intake coordinator was professional and kind. The room was clean and neutral, with a window that looked out on a small courtyard with a dormant garden. Isabella sat on the edge of the bed and put her hand on her stomach and felt James move, slow and steady, completely unbothered. "Okay," she said to him. "Here's what we're going to do." The intake paperwork she had signed, the standard documents the facility required of every patient, included on page 7, a disclosure that all common area and patient room conversations were audio recorded as a standard safety protocol, and that these recordings were the property of the facility and could be subpoenaed by law enforcement upon proper request. Isabella had read every word of the intake paperwork. She wondered if Carter had. The first catastrophe arrived on day 2 of the evaluation. Frank called Ryan, and Ryan relayed the message during the single daily supervised visit that the facility allowed. He sat across from Isabella in a small visiting room with a table bolted to the floor and said, very quietly, "Carter's attorneys filed an emergency motion to freeze the joint assets. All of them, including your personal account from before the marriage. They're claiming you've been erratically moving money in preparation to flee." Isabella's personal account held the savings from 11 years of corporate law practice, money that predated Carter by nearly a decade. Money that was, by every legal standard, entirely hers. Frozen. She had $47 in a wallet in her room and a prepaid phone Ryan had smuggled inside a hollowed-out paperback novel about the French Riviera, which she had found genuinely funny under the circumstances. "Okay," she said. Ryan stared at her. "Okay? Okay. What else?" He hesitated. Then he pulled out his phone and showed her a screenshot of a magazine website. The article was from a Hartford lifestyle publication. The headline read, "Standing by Him, One Woman's Account of Watching a Marriage Fracture from the Outside." The byline was Brooke Calloway. Isabella read the pull quote at the top. "I feel terrible for her. Pregnancy can do frightening things to a woman's mind." She read the part where Brooke described Isabella as volatile and paranoid, where she quoted Carter's friends, unnamed, saying they had been worried about Isabella for months. She read the carefully calibrated language that positioned Brooke as a concerned bystander rather than an active participant in her husband's plan to murder her. She read it to the end. Then she handed the phone back to Ryan. "Carter just made his first real mistake," she said. Ryan blinked. "Bella, the man froze your bank accounts and had you committed. What qualifies as a mistake at this point?" "He went public," Isabella said, "which means I can go public." Ryan was quiet, working through this. "He built a media narrative," Isabella continued. "He put Brooke in front of a journalist. He got his friends to go on record. He invited the court of public opinion into this. And the court of public opinion, Ryan, does not require the same evidentiary standards as family court. It only requires a good story told credibly by someone the audience believes." "You're thinking about Sandra Pierce." "I'm thinking about Sandra Pierce." Sandra Pierce hosted the most-watched morning program on the NBC affiliate in Hartford. Isabella had served on 3 charity committees with her. Sandra was sharp, fair, and had a viewership of 240,000 people who trusted her completely. "We're not ready yet," Ryan said carefully. "Not yet," Isabella agreed. "But we're building toward it." The third catastrophe came that afternoon. A social worker named Patricia Owens visited Isabella's room. She was professional and careful and unhappy about her errand, which Isabella could see clearly. "Mrs. Whitfield," Patricia said, "I want to make sure you understand the court's current position. Once the baby is born, if the concerns about your stability have not been resolved to the court's satisfaction, there is a possibility of a temporary custody arrangement." "With my husband," Isabella said. "With the child's father, yes. Temporarily, pending further evaluation." Patricia left. Isabella sat on the edge of the bed. She put both hands on her stomach, on James, who was moving in slow circles, completely trusting her. She allowed herself 4 minutes. She had learned to budget these moments, because grief and fear do not disappear when you suppress them. They only wait, and they must be given their time, or they take it anyway at worse moments. So she gave them 4 minutes. She shook. She cried silently, the way she had learned to cry during depositions when something unexpected moved her, and she could not let it show. She let herself feel the full weight of what was happening. Then she wiped her face. She picked up the smuggled phone. She called Maggie. "I need you to get me out of here," she said. "Bring the vitamin lab report. Bring the independent psych evaluation we discussed. And call Frank, because I think we're ready to move." Maggie said, "I'll be there in the morning." Isabella lay down on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about Helena Whitfield, who had stood on a deck in the rain in Lake Tahoe and not known that the railing had been compromised by a man her husband had paid, who had not had a Maggie, or a Ryan, or a Frank, who had not had 11 years of litigation experience and a very specific understanding of what intake paperwork could mean. "Not us," she said quietly, to James, to the ceiling, to whatever was listening. "Not us." Maggie arrived at 9:15 in the morning with the vitamin lab report, a letter from an independent psychiatrist named Dr. Carol Brennan, who had evaluated Isabella via a 2-hour video session and found no evidence of psychosis or instability, and a coffee she had to surrender at the front desk, which she described as a human rights violation. The facility's medical director, a methodical man named Dr. George Patton, reviewed Dr. Brennan's evaluation against Dr. Farr's. He reviewed Isabella's documented behavior during the 72-hour stay, which had been, by every measurable standard, calm, coherent, and appropriate. He reviewed the vitamin lab report, which he found extremely concerning. He released Isabella at 11:30 on a Thursday morning. She walked out into November air that was cold and clean and tasted like freedom, which she was aware was a cliché and did not care even slightly. Ryan was in the parking lot. He hugged her for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Frank has something." Frank was at Ryan's house, at the kitchen table, with his laptop and 4 separate stacks of documents and a legal pad covered in his cramped handwriting. He stood when Isabella came in and shook her hand with the formality of a man who expressed respect through actions rather than words. "Sit down," he said. "This is good." He pulled out a document. Carter's financial records from the Helena Whitfield estate. The insurance payout, $18 million. Here's where it gets interesting. He turned the laptop to face her. 6 weeks after Helena died, Carter transferred $4 million to an LLC in Delaware. Greenway Consulting Partners. The LLC had 1 registered agent. He pointed to the name on the screen, Douglas Grimley. Isabella felt it moving into place. "Todd Grimley's father," she said. "Older brother," Frank said. "Douglas Grimley is Todd Grimley's older brother, which makes him Brooke Calloway's older brother as well." The room was very quiet. "Carter didn't just find a convenient mistress," Isabella said slowly. "He found the Grimley family, or they found him. Either way, this was coordinated. The $4 million payment to Douglas Grimley's LLC suggests that Todd Grimley was paid for the work on Helena's deck through a corporate intermediary, making it look like a legitimate business transaction." Frank paused. "And Brooke's role, we believe, was to establish herself in Carter's life before Isabella discovered the affair, to be positioned as the sympathetic new partner when everything was resolved." "She's not just a mistress," Isabella said. "She's the finale. She's what comes after." "Yes." Isabella sat with this for a moment. Then she felt the first clean thing she had felt in weeks. Clarity. Not relief, not victory, but the specific, focused clarity of a trial attorney who has just seen the whole shape of the opposition's case and knows exactly where the weaknesses are. "We have enough to go to the state attorney," she said. "We have enough for them to open an investigation," Frank said carefully. "Whether it's enough for charges, that depends on what they find when they start pulling on these threads. Then let's give them the threads." Isabella looked at Ryan. "And I want to talk to Sandra Pierce." Ryan and Frank exchanged a glance. "There's a timing issue," Frank said. His phone rang before he could explain further. He answered it, listened. His face did something that Isabella had not seen it do before. It went completely blank. The expression of a man receiving news so bad that his face simply declined to process it. He ended the call. "Carter's attorneys filed an emergency injunction tonight," he said. "They're claiming that the tracking software on your secondary phone and the recordings made inside the Whitfield house constitute illegal surveillance. They're arguing that everything you collected inside the house is inadmissible under Connecticut wiretapping statutes." The silence lasted a long time. "All of it?" Isabella said. "They're claiming all of it. Every recording made inside the house." Ryan put both hands flat on the table. Isabella looked at the stack of documents, the financial records, the vitamin lab report, the Grimley connections, all of it carefully built over 3 weeks of risk. The recordings from inside the house had been their strongest evidence. Carter's voice, his own words, his own conversations with Brooke and with his attorneys. Potentially inadmissible. What do we actually have? Isabella said. Her voice was steady. This cost her something. Not what we hoped we had. What we actually have. Frank went through it, methodically, the way she had asked, without softening. The vitamin lab report, admissible. Maggie had ordered it as a treating physician. The financial records, partially admissible. Public records could not be suppressed. The Grimley connection, admissible. Public incorporation documents, public registry, the house recordings. In serious legal jeopardy. It's not enough for attempted murder, Frank said. Not yet. Isabella nodded. She was quiet for a long moment. Ryan made toast, because their mother had always made toast when things were at their worst, and said it in front of her without a word. You're making toast, Isabella said. Whole wheat, Ryan said. It's very supportive. She ate a piece of toast. She thought about Carter, about his absolute certainty that he had outmaneuvered her, about the injunction filed at 11 at night, the precision of it, the confidence of a man who believed he had just pulled the floor out from under her. She thought about the intake paperwork. Page 7. Carter made another mistake, she said. Ryan and Frank both looked at her. When he had me admitted to the facility, Isabella said slowly, he signed the intake paperwork as my emergency contact, as my spouse authorizing the voluntary admission. Yes, Frank said. The facility records all patient room conversations as a standard safety protocol. The disclosure is on page 7 of the intake paperwork. She looked at Frank. Carter signed those forms. He consented to the facility's recording policy on behalf of the admission. Frank went very still. He came to visit me, Isabella said. On the second day, he believed I was medicated. He spoke freely to Davis Hargrove in what he thought was a private consultation room inside the facility. Frank opened his laptop. The facility's recordings, he said, are the facility's legal property, not yours, not Carter's. They can be subpoenaed by law enforcement with a proper request. And whatever Carter said in that room, Ryan said slowly, is not subject to any claim of illegal surveillance by me, Isabella finished, because I didn't record him, they did. Frank looked at her for a long moment. He had been a detective for 30 years. He had seen a great many things. I'll call the state attorney's office in the morning, he said. And Isabella, he paused. Call Sandra Pierce. Sandra Pierce agreed in 45 seconds. This was partly because Sandra was a journalist who recognized a story of extraordinary magnitude when it walked into her phone. It was partly because she had sat next to Isabella at 3 charity galas and found her to be a woman of exceptional intelligence and precision. And it was partly because Sandra had met Carter Whitfield twice and found him, both times, to be the specific kind of charming that sets off a particular alarm in women who have been paying attention for a long time. The plan was specific. Isabella would appear on Sandra's live morning program. She would present only what was legally admissible and publicly documented. She would not reference the house recordings. She would not speculate. She would let the documents speak. And she would tell the audience about the facility intake paperwork, not the contents of whatever Carter had said, just the existence of the recording protocol. Just enough for the state attorney's office, who were already in conversation with Frank, to understand publicly that there was a legal avenue they had not yet explored. Carter's attorney would try to stop it. But stopping a live broadcast of a private citizen presenting publicly documented evidence was not something Connecticut law made easy. Ryan drove Isabella to the studio on a Friday morning. She was wearing a powder blue maternity dress she had bought 3 months ago for a charity luncheon. She was 35 weeks pregnant and had slept 4 hours and felt, she told Ryan, completely ready. "You look like you're going to cross-examine someone," Ryan said. "I am," she said. The studio was smaller than it looked on television, which Isabella found reassuring. The audience of 200 women was seated in curved rows. Sandra Pierce met her backstage, took both of her hands, and looked at her with the directness of a woman who had interviewed governors and grieving mothers and was not easily impressed. "Are you sure about this?" Sandra asked. "Completely," Isabella said. They sat down. The cameras found their positions. The floor director counted down. Sandra turned to Isabella with the warm professionalism of 15 years of live television. "Isabella," she said, "you've agreed to come here this morning to talk about something that I think is going to shock a lot of people. You were admitted to a psychiatric facility 2 weeks ago on the petition of your husband. You are currently 35 weeks pregnant, and you are here telling us that your husband has been trying to kill you." "Yes," Isabella said. "And I have documentation." She presented the vitamin lab report first. A copy was displayed on the studio monitor. She explained, in clear and simple language, what the lab had found. Synthetic pyridoxine at 4 times the recommended dose, and phenobarbital, a mild sedative, and vitamins her husband had been providing her for an unknown period of time. She explained the medical implications. She explained that the vitamins were still in evidence with law enforcement. The audience was completely silent. She presented the financial records next. The secret credit card, the Mayflower Hotel charges, aligned with Brooke Calloway's public Instagram location tags. She noted that she had cross-referenced these on a publicly accessible social media account and that Carter's attorneys were welcome to challenge her methodology. She presented the Grimley connection last, the public incorporation documents for Greenway Consulting Partners, Douglas Grimley as registered agent, the wire transfer from Carter's account 6 weeks after Helena Whitfield's death, Todd Grimley's professional credentials as a structural safety engineer, his relationship to Brooke Calloway, whose legal name was Brooke Grimley. She did not editorialize. She let the documents speak. The audience, which had been silent, began to make sounds, not loud sounds, the quiet sounds of 200 people processing something they had not expected to process before 9 in the morning. Sandra said, "Isabella, you mentioned before we went to air that there was something else, something about the facility where you were held." "Yes," Isabella said. "The Fairfield County Behavioral Health Center, where Carter had me admitted, records all patient room conversations as a standard safety protocol. This is disclosed in the intake paperwork, which Carter signed as my authorizing spouse." She looked directly into camera 2. "Carter came to visit me on the 2nd day of my stay. He believed I was medicated and largely unaware of my surroundings. He spoke freely in what he assumed was a private consultation space inside the facility." She paused. "The facility's recordings are their legal property. The state attorney's office submitted a proper subpoena request yesterday morning." Another pause. "I didn't record my husband. The psychiatric facility he had me committed to did." The studio was absolutely silent for 3 full seconds. Then Sandra said, very quietly, "And you're saying that those recordings contain—" "I'm saying that the state attorney's office will be able to tell you what those recordings contain," Isabella said. "And I expect they will be doing so very soon." Her phone, sitting face down on the studio desk, at Sandra's request for the visual effect, lit up. Sandra saw it. She had agreed to this part. She said, "Isabella, is that—" Isabella turned the phone over. The text was from Frank. She read it aloud. Carter Whitfield was taken into custody at his office in Greenwich at 11:15 this morning. The studio audience, 200 women who had come to a Friday morning taping to watch lifestyle segments and cooking demonstrations, broke into applause that lasted 45 seconds. In Ryan's living room, where Frank was watching on a laptop, Frank pumped his fist once, which was the most demonstrative gesture anyone had ever seen him make. Ryan, sitting beside him, was crying in a way that he would later describe, consistently and insistently, as severe seasonal allergies. Frank looked at him. "You're crying," Frank said. "Allergies," Ryan said. "It's November. I'm very sensitive." Brooke Grimley was arrested at Bradley International Airport at 12:40 that afternoon. She was attempting to board a flight to Fort Lauderdale with a carry-on bag that contained, among other things, a Delaware LLC dissolution document and $60,000 in cash. In an envelope that was, the arresting officer noted in his report, not particularly well hidden. Todd Grimley was arrested at his engineering firm in Westchester County, New York the following morning on charges related to the Helena Whitfield case, which the Lake Tahoe authorities had agreed to reopen in light of the new evidence. The deck of the Lake Tahoe property, still standing because it had never been resold, was examined by an independent structural engineer who found that 2 of the primary support brackets had been replaced at some point with components that were rated for a significantly lower load than the originals, and that this replacement would not have been visible in a standard visual inspection. Helena Whitfield had stood on that deck in the rain, and the deck had held her weight on 7 previous occasions because she had stood in slightly different positions, and on the 8th occasion, it had not, because the weather was different and she was standing closer to the rail. This was in the engineering report. Isabella read the engineering report in Ryan's kitchen and thought about Helena Marsh, who had grown up in Connecticut, who had married Carter, loved sailing, who had married Carter Whitfield because he was exactly the kind of man she had been told to want, and she allowed herself to grieve for Helena for a long time. Dr. William Farr surrendered his medical license within 48 hours of the broadcast. The state medical board had received 6 separate complaints by noon on Friday. An investigation into the manufactured psychiatric evaluation and into his relationship with Douglas Grimley and Carter Whitfield was opened immediately. He was cooperating with prosecutors, Frank said, with the alacrity of a man who understood that cooperation was his only available currency. Davis Hargrove, Carter's attorney, withdrew from representation and declined to comment. Carter was held without bail. His attorney, a new one from a firm in Manhattan, filed 3 separate motions in the first week. All 3 were denied. The financial picture, which the state attorney's forensic accountants were now unraveling with the thoroughness of people who genuinely enjoyed their work, was almost breathtaking in its complexity. Carter had not simply been running a failing company. He had been running a fraud operation layered inside the failing company, moving money through shell corporations across 4 states and 2 countries, borrowing against assets he had already borrowed against, maintaining the appearance of $400 million in wealth with approximately $90 million in actual assets. The insurance policy on Isabella's life was $42 million. With that payout and the controlled liquidation of his legitimate assets, Carter would have cleared his debts and had, according to the forensic accountant's preliminary estimate, approximately $12 million left over. $12 million was, apparently, worth 3 human lives. Frank said this in Ryan's kitchen one evening, in the flat tone of a man who had spent 30 years being surprised by nothing and was still occasionally surprised by the specific mathematics of human cruelty. "12 million, Ryan said. "Approximately," Frank said. They were quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about Helena," Isabella said. "Her family is in Vermont. I want to go see them." "After the baby," Ryan said. "After the baby," Isabella agreed. She was 36 weeks pregnant. The nursery in the Whitfield estate, which she had not returned to, had a white crib that had taken 6 weeks to arrive from a craftsman in Vermont. She had Maggie transfer her prenatal records to a practice in Old Greenwich, closer to Ryan's house. She was staying with Ryan. She had $47 in her wallet and a frozen bank account and a case proceeding through the Connecticut criminal court system. She also had, Maggie assured her, a completely healthy son who was in an excellent position and appeared to be in no particular hurry to arrive. "He's comfortable," Maggie said at the 36-week appointment. "He's practical," Isabella said. "He's waiting for the legal situation to resolve itself." Maggie laughed. It was the first time Isabella had heard Maggie laugh in 3 weeks, and it was a good sound. "Bella," Maggie said, "for the record, you are the best friend I could have possibly had in this situation. I need you to know that." "You got me out of a psychiatric facility," Isabella said. "I think that makes us even. We were never keeping score." "I know," Isabella said. "That's what I love about you." James Hartwell was born on a Tuesday. 8 pounds, 4 ounces, 21 inches, a full head of dark hair, and the serious, evaluating expression of someone who had just arrived in a place he was not entirely sure about and was taking his time deciding what he thought. The labor was 11 hours. Ryan paced the waiting room for 9 of them in a pattern that the nursing staff found both endearing and slightly alarming. Maggie delivered James herself, which was not standard practice for an OB at a hospital where she did not have privileges, and which she accomplished by calling in a favor from a colleague that she described as, quote, "the largest favor I have ever asked of anyone in my professional life," and which Isabella would later dedicate a full chapter of her book to. When James was placed on Isabella's chest, she looked at him for a long time without speaking. He looked back at her with the serious dark eyes that would eventually remind everyone who knew the family of Isabella's father. "Hi," Isabella said. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." James considered this information. Then he yawned enormously, apparently satisfied. Ryan was allowed in. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at his nephew with the expression of a man confronting something so large and good that his face could not quite contain it. "He's enormous," Ryan said. 8'4", Maggie said proudly, as though she had personally arranged this. "He looks like Dad," Ryan said. His voice did the thing it did sometimes. "I know," Isabella said. "That's a good thing." "I know." Ryan touched James's hand very carefully with one finger. James grabbed it with the automatic, totalizing grip of a newborn. And Ryan laughed, a surprised and completely unguarded sound. Isabella watched her brother holding her son's hand and felt something release in her chest. Some tension she had been holding so long she had stopped noticing it, releasing now like a breath she had forgotten she was holding. Maggie excused herself to the hallway. Ryan asked her later if she was okay. She said she was a physician, and physicians were allowed to have feelings. They simply could not have them in front of patients. The bank account was unfrozen 2 days after James was born, pursuant to a court order that Frank had filed the morning of the broadcast. The forensic evidence made the freeze untenable, and Carter's new attorneys did not contest it. Isabella filed for divorce on the same day she brought James home from the hospital. She named him James Hartwell. She had considered this carefully and at length. Carter's last name was not something she wanted James to carry, not out of bitterness, but out of the practical understanding that a child should not have to explain for the rest of his life that his father was serving a life sentence. James Hartwell was his grandfather's name and his mother's name, and the name of a family that had been there when it mattered. Ryan helped her move her things from the Whitfield estate on a cold December morning. Carter's personal attorney, under instructions from the court, provided access. The house was exactly as she had left it. The white flowers on the kitchen island replaced by new white flowers on a schedule that apparently continued regardless of circumstances. Isabella walked through the rooms once, quickly, not looking for anything, just marking the end of something. In the nursery, she stood for a moment at the white crib. She had chosen it from a catalog. She had imagined then what it would feel like to stand in this room with her son. She had imagined Carter beside her. She had imagined a life that had never been real. She picked up the crib. Ryan helped her carry it to the truck. She was going to use it. It was a beautiful crib. It was not the crib's fault. Carter's trial began in March. Isabella testified for 4 hours. She was methodical and precise and occasionally very carefully human. She described the moment in Maggie's office when she understood the vitamins had been poisoned. She described lying in the narrow bed in the facility, her hands on James, making a promise. She described signing the intake paperwork on page 7. The facility's recording of Carter's second-day visit to the facility was played for the jury. Carter's voice, speaking freely to Davis Hargrove in what he had believed was a private consultation room, explaining the financial structure of the insurance fraud, the Grimley arrangement, the timeline for what he called resolving the situation, filled the courtroom. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They found Carter Whitfield guilty on all counts: attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and added following the reopening of the Lake Tahoe investigation, first-degree murder in the death of Helena Whitfield. Judge Fletcher, who had issued the psychiatric hold 3 months earlier, and who Isabella suspected had been carrying that decision with him every day since, sentenced Carter to life without the possibility of parole. He looked at Carter as he read the sentence and said, "You systematically used the legal system, the medical system, and the financial system as weapons against the person you had pledged to protect. This court cannot undo the damage you have done, but it can ensure that you are not permitted to do it again." Isabella was in the first row. When they led Carter out, he looked at her once. The calculating expression she had seen that first morning, looking out the window at her in the driveway, was still there, but something underneath it had changed. Something had gone out of it. She met his gaze steadily. She did not look away until he did. 6 months after the sentencing, Isabella sat on the front porch of Ryan's house on an evening in late summer, watching James investigate a maple leaf with the focused intensity of a person encountering something entirely new. He was 6 months old. He could sit up with support. He had 2 opinions, approximately, and he expressed both of them with conviction. Ryan came out with 2 glasses of iced tea and sat in the other porch chair, and they watched James examine the maple leaf in companionable silence for a while. "Frank called," Ryan said. "What did he say?" "Helena's family. Her sister in Vermont. She wants to meet you." Isabella had been expecting this call for months. She had reached out to Helena's family through an attorney shortly after the sentencing, offering whatever they needed: testimony, documentation, her presence, anything. Helena's sister, a woman named Carol Marsh, had not been ready then. "Tell Frank I'll go whenever Carol is ready," Isabella said. Ryan nodded. He handed her the iced tea. James abandoned the maple leaf and looked at both of them with the serious, evaluating expression that had been his primary expression since the moment of his birth, as though he was constantly taking attendance and wanted to confirm that everyone was present. "Hi, baby," Isabella said. James reached for her iced tea glass. She moved it out of reach. He looked at her with an expression of profound philosophical disagreement. "Not yet," she said. He appeared to be filing a formal objection. Isabella had gone back to law 3 months after James was born, which was 2 months earlier than anyone who knew her thought was wise, and approximately the right time according to Isabella, who had never been good at inactivity. She had opened a small practice in Old Greenwich, 2 offices above a bookstore, with a focus on financial abuse cases. Specifically, cases in which one partner had used financial control as a mechanism of coercion and harm. Maggie sent her 2 referrals in the first week. Frank sent her 3 more. By the end of the first month, she had 7 active clients and a waiting list. She had also been approached by a publisher about a book. She was thinking about it, not because she wanted to relive the experience, but because there was a specific kind of knowledge embedded in what she had been through that she did not know how to pass on any other way. How the vitamins worked and what to ask your doctor. How the psychiatric petition process was being misused and what the legal remedies were. How to document financial irregularities before the accounts were frozen. How to read intake paperwork on page 7. The practical things. The things that might save someone. She was thinking about it. The evening light was doing something remarkable to the maple trees along Ryan's driveway. The same tree family as the ones at the Whitfield estate. The same October red she had stood watching through the kitchen window on the morning she had found the credit card statement. But these were different trees, and this was a different driveway, and she was a different woman, or rather she was the same woman, which was the point. She had been the same woman the entire time. The difference was that now she knew it. This is the thing about what Carter had done to her, what she had spent months understanding with Maggie's help and her own long nights and a therapist in Westport named Dr. Carol Brennan, who turned out to be extraordinary. He had not changed her. He had built a structure around her, designed to make her forget herself. The woman she had been before Carter, the litigator, the builder, the woman who trusted her own instincts, had not disappeared. She had simply been unable, for a while, to see herself clearly through the structure he had built. Once the structure came down, she was still there. She had always been there. This was what she wanted to tell other women, not her particular story, which was extreme in its specifics, but the shape of it, the way a capable and intelligent person can be convinced, over time, by someone very skilled at the process, that they are not capable or intelligent, the way the fog builds gradually, the way you can sit at a kitchen window on a perfect October morning and feel something is wrong and dismiss the feeling because the flowers are fresh and the coffee is good and everything looks from the outside exactly right, and the way the feeling is correct. James had finished his philosophical objection and moved on to examining a crack in the porch floor with the same rigorous attention. He was going to be a very thorough person. "What are you thinking?" Ryan said. "I'm thinking about the book," Isabella said. "I'm thinking I might title it Frozen Trust. And I'm thinking the last chapter should be practical, not inspirational, not motivational, just practical. Here are the things to do. Here is how the systems work. Here are the questions to ask." "That sounds like you," Ryan said. "That's the point," Isabella said. She picked James up carefully, the way you pick up someone whose solidity still sometimes surprises you. He looked at her with his serious dark eyes, and then, apparently having decided that everything was adequately accounted for, leaned his head against her shoulder. The evening was warm, and the maple trees were turning, and Ryan was beside her, and everything was imperfect in the normal human way, which was all anyone could really ask for. She thought about Helena Marsh, who had loved sailing, who had not had a Maggie or a Ryan or 11 years of litigation experience. She thought about Carol Marsh in Vermont, waiting to talk to her. She thought about the 7 women on her waiting list and the things she was going to be able to help them document and protect and fight for. She thought about James, who would grow up knowing that his mother was someone who trusted her instincts, who paid attention, who read the paperwork all the way to page 7. She thought about the practical things she wanted to say to anyone who might be sitting at a kitchen window right now, feeling something they could not name. Trust that feeling. It is not anxiety. It is intelligence. Document everything starting today. Photograph financial records and store them somewhere only you can access. Know what is in every supplement you take. Read every document you sign, especially intake paperwork. Keep one account that is only yours. Keep one friend who knew you before. If someone is working hard to convince you that you are not capable of trusting your own mind, that is not love. That is a strategy. And you are allowed to build a counter-strategy. You are allowed to read the paperwork on page 7. You are allowed to call your brother. You are allowed to be at 35 weeks pregnant and freezing and alone in a psychiatric facility, the most dangerous thing your husband has ever underestimated. James shifted against her shoulder and sighed the enormous, satisfied sigh of a person who has had an extremely productive afternoon. I know, Isabella said. The maple trees went on turning red, which they did every year without fail, which was one of the things you could count on, the world continuing to be beautiful in the specific ways it had always been beautiful, even after everything, especially after everything. Ryan reached over and clinked his iced tea glass against hers without speaking, which was exactly the right thing, and they sat on the porch in the late summer light and watched James fall asleep. And the evening settled around them with the quiet completeness of something that has ended well. Editorial disclaimer. The story you just heard was carefully researched, constructed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaning, emotional truth, and real value to every person who listens. While the characters and specific events are dramatized, the patterns of psychological abuse, financial coercion, and manipulation depicted in this story reflect documented, real-world experiences. Our goal is never simply to entertain. It is to make sure that anyone who needs to recognize something recognizes it. If this story helped you see something more clearly, then it did exactly what it was meant to do.